Dr. Alexander Martins was known for his competence and dedication to his work. Tall, with gray hair and an attentive gaze, he walked the hospital corridors with a confidence that inspired everyone around him. His reputation as one of the best surgeons in the city was not just a reflection of his technical skill, but also his ability to make quick and precise decisions in critical moments. Despite his apparent empathy in the hospital environment, Dr. Alexander had a rigid view of the homeless. To him, medicine was a sacred field, reserved for those he considered worthy of care. The patients he treated were often community members who could afford his services or had health insurance that covered the exorbitant costs of treatments. The homeless, with their dirty clothes and lost looks, were a reality he preferred to ignore. Every morning, leaving his house in an affluent neighborhood, Dr. Alexander would pass by corners where beggars extended their hands, asking for help. He would look away, justifying to himself that he couldn't do anything for those people. They chose this path, he thought, believing that most had gone astray through poor choices and lack of effort. At home, Dr. Alexander was a loving father to his 8-year-old son, Lucas. Lucas was his treasure, the joy that brightened his days after long hours at the hospital. The boy had bright eyes and an insatiable curiosity about the world. He often asked questions about his father's work, admiring him as a hero. To Lucas, his father could do anything, cure any illness, save any life. But at that moment, as Dr. Alexander tightened his tie and prepared for another day of work, he had no idea that his world was about to be shaken. A lesson in humanity and empathy was coming, something no medical book could teach. It was a cold and rainy morning when Dr. Alexander, protected by a black umbrella, hurried along the wet sidewalks of downtown on his way to the hospital. The air was heavy, and water formed small puddles on the uneven cobblestones. He kept his gaze fixed ahead, trying to avoid the hunched figures under torn blankets and cardboard boxes lining the entrances of closed shops. Suddenly, a hoarse and desperate voice cut through the constant sound of the rain. "Please, doctor, help me." Dr. Alexander stopped and turned, finding a thin man with a disheveled beard and pleading eyes. The man was soaked, shivering with cold, and extended a bony hand toward the doctor. I'm sick. I need help, please," the beggar pleaded, his voice breaking with the urgency of his plea. Dr. Alexander looked at him for a moment, his heart torn between moral obligation and his ingrained beliefs. The sight of the man was deplorable. His body was covered in sores, and he seemed on the verge of collapse. But the doctor quickly regained his composure, his face assuming a cold and distant expression. "Sorry, but I can't help," Dr. Alexander replied, trying to keep his voice firm. "There are places that can assist people in your situation. Look for a shelter or a public hospital." The beggar, realizing the refusal, let his hand fall and his eyes filled with sadness and resignation. "I've tried, but no one helps me. I just need a little care, sir. I'm dying." But Dr. Alexander, already turning his back, walked away. "I can't do anything," he repeated without looking back. The sound of the rain seemed louder now, almost deafening, as he distanced himself from the scene. As he continued on his way, the doctor felt a slight pressure in his chest, a feeling of discomfort that he quickly brushed aside. "I have bigger responsibilities," he thought, trying to justify his decision. But the image of the beggar's eyes was etched in his mind, haunting him for the rest of the day. Arriving at the hospital, Dr. Alexander threw himself into his work, attending to patients and performing surgeries with the precision and skill that characterized him. However, even amid the frenetic routine, he couldn't forget that morning's encounter. The beggar's pleading eyes seemed to follow his every step, a persistent reminder he couldn't simply ignore. A few blocks away, under an overpass that offered minimal protection against the relentless rain, the beggar, whose name was João, took shelter. João hadn't always lived on the streets. There was a time when he had a home, a family, and dreams. But life, with its relentless cruelty, had taken everything from him, one painful loss after another. João grew up in a small rural town, the son of farmers. His childhood was marked by days spent outdoors, running through fields and helping his parents with the harvest. As a young man, he moved to the big city in search of opportunities, determined to build a better future. He got a job as a factory worker, married Maria, the woman he loved, and together they had a daughter, Anna. But fate can be ruthless. The factory where he worked closed its doors during an economic crisis, leaving João unemployed. Desperate to support his family, he took on sporadic and poorly paid jobs. The tension and stress began to affect his marriage, and Maria, unable to bear the pressure, left him, taking Anna with her. João fell into a spiral of despair. Without a steady job, without a family, and without direction, he ended up on the streets. He tried to find work, but opportunities were scarce, and his unkempt appearance drove employers away. His health began to deteriorate, with malnutrition and the harsh living conditions taking their toll. In recent years, João had learned to survive on very little. The nights were cold and lonely, and the constant fear of violence made sleep a rare luxury. He wandered the streets during the day, looking for scraps of food and a safe place to rest. But despite everything, he still carried a glimmer of hope in his heart, a desire to find a way out of his situation. On that rainy morning, when he saw Dr. Alexander, João saw an opportunity. He knew he urgently needed medical help. His wounds were infected, and he felt a growing weakness that worried him deeply. The doctor's refusal was a devastating blow, but João didn't have the strength to insist. He returned to his shelter under the overpass, trying to warm himself with the few rags he had, while tears mixed with the incessant rain. João lay down, exhausted, trying to forget the pain and loneliness that dominated his life. He closed his eyes, hoping that sleep would take him away from that nightmare, if only for a few hours. In the darkness under the overpass, he dreamed of better days, of a life where he wasn't invisible, where someone cared enough to reach out and help. Dr. Alexander's alarm clock rang promptly at 5 in the morning, signaling the start of another exhausting day. He got up quickly, already accustomed to the routine he had established with almost military discipline. After a brief exercise session to keep his body in shape, he headed to the bathroom, where he washed his face and stared at his reflection in the mirror, remembering the countless lives that depended on his steady hands and sharp mind. Breakfast was a quick meal, often eaten standing up, while he mentally reviewed the day's cases. Dr. Alexander was meticulous in his preparation. Every detail mattered. He kissed Lucas on the forehead, still asleep, and left quietly so as not to wake his son. The drive to the hospital was a familiar route, traveled so many times it had become almost automatic, his hands firmly gripping the steering wheel while the radio played the news of the day. At the hospital, Dr. Alexander swapped his suit jacket for a white coat and plunged into the whirlwind of activities. Mornings began with team meetings, where they discussed the most critical cases. His colleagues respected him not only for his skill but also for his leadership in times of crisis. After the meetings came the rounds with hospitalized patients, where his clinical eye and encouraging words brought a bit of hope to the cold, anxiety-filled corridors. Each surgery was a test of his abilities and a challenge he embraced with intense passion. The operating room was his sanctuary, a place where he felt most alive. The procedures varied from complex operations requiring hours of concentration to quick interventions, but no less important. His focus was absolute. His hands moved with surgical precision, and his mind was always 2 steps ahead, anticipating any complications. Between surgeries, Dr. Alexander dedicated time to consultations, listening attentively to patients and their families' concerns. His ability to explain complicated diagnoses in an understandable way was one of his greatest qualities. However, his empathy seemed to have limits, especially when it came to cases he considered beyond his scope, such as the homeless who were often brought to the hospital in deplorable conditions. Afternoons quickly turned into nights, and Dr. Alexander often lost track of time. When he finally allowed himself a break, it was to review patient charts and prepare for the next day's cases. His mind rarely rested, always thinking about the next surgery, the next patient, the next life to be saved. Returning home late at night, Dr. Alexander felt the weight of the day on his shoulders, but also the satisfaction of a job well done. Dinner was often a solitary meal, except for the times when Lucas was still awake, waiting to tell him about his day at school. These were the rare occasions when the doctor allowed himself to disconnect from the hospital and reconnect with his role as a father. In bed, exhausted, he tried to push thoughts of work aside and focus on the few hours of sleep he had left. But inevitably, the image of that beggar and his desperate eyes returned to his mind, reminding him that no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't save everyone. In the silence of the night, Dr. Alexander wondered if he was truly doing everything he could, or if he had lost himself in his own arrogance and lack of empathy. Lucas, 8 years old, was the light of Dr. Alexander's life, a boy full of energy, curiosity, and a generous heart that captivated everyone around him. With light brown hair and bright eyes that always seemed to be seeking new adventures, Lucas was a constant source of joy at home. From a young age, Lucas was fascinated by his father's work. When he was younger, he would draw what he imagined the hospital to be like, with his father as a superhero in a white coat, saving lives. Dr. Alexander cherished these drawings, seeing in them his son's admiration and love. On weekends, when the doctor wasn't on call, they spent hours together building model airplanes and reading books of fantastic stories. Lucas was an observant and intelligent child. He noticed the pressure of work on his father, and even without fully understanding it, he did his best to bring lightness and joy. He knew when Dr. Alexander was tired or worried, and at those times, he made an effort to be even more present and affectionate. The boy had a typical school routine, but his curiosity went beyond books and notebooks. He loved exploring the garden, finding different insects and plants, and asking 1,000 questions about everything he saw. His mother, who had passed away when he was very young, was a topic he approached with delicacy. Lucas had few memories of her, but he treasured every detail his father told him. One of Lucas's favorite things was walking around the neighborhood with his father, even though these walks were rare due to Dr. Alexander's busy schedule. On one of these walks, Lucas showed his father the place where he liked to play, a small park with swings and big trees. The father always made sure to be present in these moments, trying to make up for the long absences with quality time. Despite his young age, Lucas already showed signs of empathy and compassion that seemed lacking in his father when dealing with the less fortunate. Once, seeing a beggar on the street, Lucas asked his father why that man was there. Dr. Alexander replied evasively, saying that they were people who had made wrong choices. But Lucas, with his pure heart, felt that the answer was not complete. "Dad, maybe he just needs a chance?" Lucas asked with the innocence of someone who still believes in human kindness. Dr. Alexander remained silent, not knowing how to respond. That innocent question echoed in his mind, but he quickly pushed the thought away, focusing on the present. Lucas continued to grow up in an environment where his father's love and dedication were palpable, though accompanied by the shadow of frequent absences and heavy responsibilities. He dreamed of being like his father, a lifesaver, but he also wanted to understand and help those who seemed invisible to adult eyes. The bond between father and son was deep, a mixture of mutual admiration and unconditional love. Lucas was the anchor that kept Dr. Alexander connected to the world outside the hospital, reminding him that besides being a brilliant doctor, he was also a dedicated and beloved father. And although he didn't know it, Lucas was about to become the key to a profound change in his father's heart. A change that would begin with an act of courage and empathy on an ordinary day but would transform their lives forever. It was a sunny afternoon, and Lucas, excited by the promise of a walk in the park, couldn't contain his excitement. Dr. Alexander, enjoying a rare day off, decided to take his son out to play and enjoy the good weather. The park was full of children running and laughing, while parents watched closely, creating an atmosphere of joy and carefree. Lucas ran from one side to the other, exploring every corner of the park, while Dr. Alexander sat on a nearby bench, enjoying the moment of tranquility. Lucas's laughter was like music to his ears, a welcome break from the frantic and stressful hospital routine. Suddenly, Lucas saw a dog across the street. Without thinking twice, he ran toward the animal, crossing the sidewalk and stepping into the road. Dr. Alexander, noticing his son's movement, quickly stood up, his heart racing. "Lucas, stop. Come back here," he shouted, his voice filled with panic. Everything happened in an instant. A car was speeding, the driver distracted and without time to react. The sound of tires screeching on the asphalt was deafening, a harbinger of impending disaster. Dr. Alexander started to run, but he knew he wouldn't reach in time. And then, like a miracle amid the chaos, a familiar figure appeared. João, the beggar Dr. Alexander had ignored, was on the other side of the street. Without hesitation, João ran towards Lucas, driven by a courage that only desperation can generate. With a final push, he reached the boy and shoved him out of the way, saving him from being hit. The car passed within inches of João, who fell to the ground from the impact of the maneuver. Lucas, dazed but unharmed, looked at his savior with wide eyes. Dr. Alexander arrived shortly after, his heart pounding, and pulled Lucas into his arms, frantically checking if he was hurt. "Are you okay, son? Are you okay?" he repeated, as tears of relief began to stream down his face. Lucas nodded, still trying to process what had happened. Dr. Alexander then turned to João, who was lying on the ground, breathing heavily. "My God, you saved my son," said Dr. Alexander, his voice choked with gratitude and disbelief. He knelt beside João, his medical mind already assessing the possible injuries. "Please, let me help. Are you hurt?" João, with a weak smile, replied. He needed help. I couldn't let anything happen to him. His eyes, tired but determined, met Dr. Alexander's, and at that moment, the doctor saw something he had never noticed before. He saw humanity, courage, and compassion in a man he had dismissed as irrelevant. Dr. Alexander called an ambulance, holding João's hand while they waited. The sirens in the distance announced the arrival of help, but for Dr. Alexander, the real rescue had come from an unexpected source. As the chaos calmed and Lucas nestled in his arms, Dr. Alexander felt a profound change begin to take shape within him, a lesson in empathy and humility he would never forget. João felt the cold asphalt against his skin and the distant sound of sirens. His thoughts were clouded by pain, but Lucas' face, with his scared eyes, remained clear in his mind. Every movement cost him immense effort, but he knew he had done the right thing. In that moment, the homeless man was more than his condition. He was a hero, even if no one but the boy and his father knew it. Dr. Alexander held João's hand tightly, as if trying to convey all the gratitude and regret he felt. "Stay with me, help is on the way," he said, trying to stay calm. João opened his eyes with difficulty, focusing on the doctor's face. I just did what anyone would do," João murmured, his voice weak but full of sincerity. Dr. Alexander felt a lump in his throat. He knew not everyone would have done what João did, especially under the conditions he lived in. "You saved my son's life," Dr. Alexander replied, his voice breaking. "I can never thank you enough." The ambulance arrived, and the paramedics quickly took over João's care. Dr. Alexander, with his medical knowledge, helped stabilize him while explaining the situation to the paramedics. Lucas, still in shock, watched everything intently, holding his father's hand. "Is he going to be okay, Dad?" Lucas asked, his voice trembling. Dr. Alexander looked at his son and then at João, who was being placed on the stretcher. "We'll do everything we can to help him," the doctor promised. Deep down, he knew João had a long road to recovery, but at that moment, he was determined to do everything in his power to ensure he received the best possible care. At the hospital, Dr. Alexander didn't leave João's side. The medical team worked tirelessly, treating his injuries and stabilizing his condition. Dr. Alexander oversaw every procedure, feeling personally responsible for the man he had once ignored. When João's condition finally stabilized, Dr. Alexander went to the waiting room, where Lucas was with a nurse. "He's out of danger now," he said, hugging his son tightly. "But we need to hope he makes a full recovery." In the following days, Dr. Alexander visited João regularly, updating him on his progress and ensuring he was comfortable. During these visits, they talked more, and Dr. Alexander began to learn Joao's life story, the sadness and hardships that had led him to the streets, but also the strength and humanity that had never left him. Lucas also accompanied his father on these visits, bringing drawings and small tokens to cheer Joao up. The bond between the three grew stronger each day, and Dr. Alexander felt he was learning one of the most valuable lessons of his life: the importance of seeing beyond appearances and understanding the true essence of people. Joao, for his part, slowly recovered with the constant support of Dr. Alexander and Lucas. He knew his life would never be the same, but now he had new hope, a new chance to rebuild his path, thanks to the heroic act that changed everything. The weeks following Lucas' rescue by Joao brought about a profound transformation in Dr. Alexander. The doctor, once rigid and inflexible in his beliefs, began to question his attitudes and values. Each time he visited Joao in the hospital, a new layer of empathy and understanding revealed itself within him. At the hospital, the news of Joao's heroic act spread quickly. Colleagues and nurses, who had previously passed by the homeless man with indifference, now treated him with respect and admiration. Dr. Alexander observed these interactions, feeling a mix of pride and shame. Pride for Joao and shame for having failed to see the dignity and value in every human being. At home, Lucas asked deeper and deeper questions about Joao, his life on the streets, and what had led someone so brave to such a desperate situation. Dr. Alexander answered as best he could, using these conversations as an opportunity to teach his son about empathy, compassion, and the value of every human life. These changes reflected in his medical practice. Dr. Alexander began to see his patients with new eyes, striving to understand their stories and circumstances beyond symptoms and diagnoses. He started dedicating more time to cases he once considered peripheral, especially the homeless who arrived at the hospital. His approach changed from cold and clinical to one full of human warmth and genuine interest. One day, while reviewing cases with his team, a young intern asked about Joao's condition. Dr. Alexander took the opportunity to share Joao's story, emphasizing the importance of treating all patients with dignity and respect, regardless of their circumstances. Every person we encounter has a story, and everyone deserves our compassion and care, he said, his words laden with newfound wisdom. Lucas also inspired change. Dr. Alexander and he began to get involved in community projects, helping at shelters and participating in food distribution programs. These experiences not only strengthened the bond between father and son, but also deepened Dr. Alexander's understanding of the complexity of life on the streets and the importance of contributing to the community. In the operating room, Dr. Alexander felt more connected to his work than ever. Every life he touched, every surgery he performed, was now a reminder of the impact a single act of kindness and courage can have. He became a figure of inspiration for his colleagues, not just for his medical skills but also for his renewed commitment to humanity. One night, while putting Lucas to bed, Dr. Alexander looked at his son's serene face and felt deep gratitude. "Dad, do you think Joao will be okay?" Lucas asked, his eyes sleepy but full of concern. "Yes, my son, I think he'll be okay," Dr. Alexander replied, kissing the boy's forehead. "And we'll do everything we can to help him have a better life." As he left Lucas' room, Dr. Alexander reflected on the journey he and his family had traveled since that fateful day. He knew there was still much to do, many lessons to learn, but he was determined to continue on this path of transformation. Joao had not only saved his son's life, but also rescued the soul of a man who had long forgotten the true meaning of being human. The doctor walks through the bustling streets of the city, the weight of that unexpected encounter still fresh in his mind. He can't get the image of the homeless man, now an impromptu hero, out of his head, saving his son from a potentially tragic fate. Each step echoes his internal reflections, a whirlwind of thoughts consuming him. He finds himself looking back, reliving every past interaction with that unknown man who, until then, was just a nuisance on the streets. He remembers the times he averted his gaze, the times he denied help, convinced that his responsibilities were limited to the walls of his office. Now, however, everything seems different. A mix of emotions consumes him: gratitude for his son's saved life, guilt for his previous attitudes, and a strange sense of admiration for the homeless man who, with so little, risked everything to save a stranger. He wonders how he could have been so blind, so indifferent to the suffering around him. These thoughts accompany him home, where his family, unaware of what happened, welcomes him with smiles and hugs. He looks at his son, whose innocent laughter is now a precious melody he almost lost. The doctor realizes he can no longer continue as before. This encounter, this transformative experience, opened his eyes to a reality he had ignored. As the day bids farewell in shades of orange and pink in the city's sky, the doctor sits on the terrace, lost in his thoughts. For the first time in a long while, he feels truly humbled by life and others. And it is in this moment of reflection that he knows something inside him has changed forever. The doctor returns to the same streets where he first encountered the homeless man, but now his heart is different. He searches for the man who saved his son, hoping to find a way to express his gratitude and acknowledge the unlikely heroism he witnessed. Finally, he spots him in a familiar corner, wrapped in his worn-out rags. The homeless man doesn't seem to recognize him at first, his eyes tired and wary. But as the doctor approaches with a mix of determination and humility, something changes in the man's expression. They stare at each other for a moment, words seeming unnecessary given the intensity of what they experienced together. The doctor breaks the silence first, his words laden with sincerity and gratitude. He tells the homeless man how his heroic gesture changed everything, how it opened his eyes to the true essence of humanity that he had failed to see. The homeless man listens in silence, his posture slowly relaxing as the doctor's words resonate unexpectedly in his own heart. He murmurs a few humble words, acknowledging the fortune of the moment and the weight of his own actions. As the sun sets over the tall buildings, a new connection forms between these two very different men. The doctor realizes that it is not just an act of gratitude, but a profound lesson in compassion and redemption. And as they part ways, the doctor knows that this story, this transformative encounter, will continue to shape their lives in ways they can't yet imagine. The encounter with the beggar wasn't just a fleeting moment in the doctor's life. It was a turning point that resonated deeply in his existence. As the days pass, he notices subtle changes in his approach with patients, now more attentive not only to their physical conditions but also to the stories behind them. At home, his relationship with his family also evolves. He spends more time with his son, seeing him not just as a precious treasure, but as a constant reminder of what truly matters in life. His wife notices the difference in his demeanor, now softer and more understanding. In his practice, he begins to develop initiatives to help the less privileged, inspired by the compassion and courage he saw in the beggar. He dedicates part of his time to working in street clinics, offering medical care to those in need, breaking down the invisible barriers that once kept him distant. Meanwhile, the beggar experiences his own transformation. Recognition of his heroic act and his connection with the doctor bring him a new sense of purpose. He starts getting involved in rehabilitation programs for the homeless, sharing his story to inspire others to find dignity in difficult circumstances. As their lives intertwine in unexpected ways, the doctor and the beggar discover that this experience wasn't just an isolated event, but the beginning of a shared journey. And as they face life's challenges and uncertainties, both know that their transformative encounter continues to shape the course of their lives, guided by a newfound understanding of what it truly means to be human. Time has passed since that life-changing encounter. The doctor is now at a community event where homeless people receive support and assistance. He proudly watches as his son plays with other children, a bright smile lighting up his innocent face. Beside him, the beggar is now clean and dressed in simple yet dignified clothes. He is no longer just a face in the crowd, but a catalyst for real change in the community. His inspiring story helped raise funds for a new shelter, symbolizing the transformative power of compassion and second chances. The doctor and the beggar meet again, no longer as strangers but as allies in a greater cause. They share a meaningful look, silently recalling the pivotal moment that bound them together in ways neither could have predicted. As the sun sets on the horizon, A sense of peace and fulfillment envelopes everyone present. The doctor reflects on how his life has changed since that fateful day, now more complete and purposeful. He knows that what began as a singular tale of salvation has become a saga of renewal and hope for all involved. And so, with one last shared glance between the doctor, the beggar, and his son playing carefree, the story reaches its emotional conclusion. Because, in the end, what truly matters are the human bonds formed through compassion and the ability to change lives. A story that continues to resonate long after the sun sets and the lights fade. Click on the videos that are being recommended to you now.